Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Shifting Lens podcast, where we are reviewing the animal experience. Although one of the hosts, Molly, wasn't able to join us today, I'm accompanied by the other lovely host, Rebecca Madrid. And we have a really wonderful guest today, Sargon, who is a fellow Assyrian in my case. Sargon received his PhD in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations, but is also an accomplished and highly prominent author and expert on the topic of Assyrian culture and history. We'll have links in the description for his publications for anyone wanting to check that out. And on top of all of that and much more, he is also on the board of directors for the Assyrian Studies Association, which we'll also share a link for if anyone's interested. And very relevant to our conversation today, he has additionally earned a Master's of Science in Anthrozoology. Would you like to start us off by introducing us to the intersection that you might see between Assyrian studies, or I guess we could make it more general as well to looking at Middle Eastern cultures in general, and Anthrozoology?
Sure. Thank you very much, Tiamat. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for having me here. It is quite nice to be able to speak about this sort of place of intersectionality that we have, or that I certainly feel that exists here. And it's, I think, a place where a lot of folks who are unfamiliar with the world of animal studies can sort of find an entrance into it. As you said, my thesis was, as a PhD student, my thesis was on the Assyrian people and culture. In particular, I worked on the history of Assyrians in the modern Iraqi state. So I looked at the period from right around the First World War to 1988 and looked at demographic displacement, acculturation, issues of cultural genocide, ethnocide, etc. I should state cultural genocide and ethnocide are synonymous for those of you who are unfamiliar listening to the podcast. It's just simply different terms for it. But the idea was that to look for a situation where a people who were underrepresented in the Middle East for a variety of reasons could find some place to offer their narrative. And that's essentially what I wanted to do with my dissertation, was to offer a narrative of Assyrian history in the general Middle East, but in this case in particular in modern Iraqi history. And to show the connection, sort of the understanding that, or to have an understanding that, to use sort of the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr., what affects one of us directly affects us all indirectly. And so the assumption, and this sort of ties into the larger sense of animal studies, or human-animal interactions, however anyone wants to put the larger field, that if some situation is happening, or there's a marginalization happening of animals, of people, or of animals, then you're going to get a similar situation with the other group. I'm only disconnecting humans and animals. I'm fully aware that humans are animals, just for this case, for sort of a larger audience that sees them as distinct. But I think once we begin talking more about that idea of disenfranchisement, dispossession, displacement, these are all things that, while they're fairly typical for the Assyrian case in the Middle East, they can very easily be connected to so many different animal species. And so the larger sense of endangerment was what I was looking at, and how we react to endangerment. The scaling of suffering was another focus of mine on my dissertation. How we look at one group and focus on one community, in particular human communities. One human community finds, or there's a general focus on them, whereas other human communities sort of fall by the wayside. They become, or they're pushed to the margins, if you will, in that sense, marginalized. And that happens in academic discourse as much as it happens in the media, as much as it happens in sort of public history, and all of that affects the way in which we think about the world, right? The way in which we approach, oh, my knowledge base, I have X sound bites that I've heard, and I know about X people or X group or their history, et cetera, et cetera. And all that can be tied into my other degree, which was Anthrozoology, which I came at from a different perspective. But the general sense of it was that these two were very deeply connected. And I think there's a very obvious intersectional moment and space for just general, this idea of marginalization. You know, if you're, those of us who also, you know, have worked in, those folks who've worked in shelters, animal shelters at times, you almost always see situations of, you know, in the animal shelter that I've worked in, there have been occasions where there were situations of domestic abuse in a home where the animals were also abused, right? So this frequently, which is very well known. I mean, this is all documented, very scientific connections that we have for all of this. So it would make sense that you could, you know, sort of create a larger view, a larger lens, a larger methodology based on that, and sort of look at the idea of endangerment and the connections with the treatment of non-human animals with the treatment of humans as well. So that's sort of the general, the gist of what I was thinking about when I was doing my dissertation, but then also as it sort of started moving me towards animal studies. It was one, at least, sort of segue into it.
I realized that I assumed, and I think most people will know who the Assyrian peoples are. Some might think they're Syrians, but they're Assyrians, just to clarify. Would you want to give a really brief definition, maybe for someone who's not aware who the Assyrian people are? Just briefly touch on that. I just realized I jumped into the deep end and just ran with the assumption.
This is always a difficult sort of definition.
Yeah.
And so the way I usually explain it is to say that if you want to sort of have a general idea of who the Assyrians are, they are essentially they are an indigenous transnational people, and they're indigenous to the Middle East, in particular, what we think of as northern Mesopotamia. They have a distinct language, Assyrian Aramaic, that they speak that goes back thousands of years. They have a particular tangible and intangible cultural heritage that stretches back at least 4,000 or 5,000 years. They are the descendants of the ancient Assyrians of Mesopotamia. And they follow the Sumero-Akkadians as sort of one continuous civilization in many ways. So if folks may have some idea of who different groups in the Middle East are, the general idea is that the Assyrians are a distinct ethnic, cultural, and linguistic indigenous people in the region. They have a large diaspora. Most Assyrians now live in diaspora. They've been dispossessed and displaced for a number of years. Most of that started in the modern day in World War I. So major genocide against the Assyrians occurred in World War I. Assyrians lost, by most accounts, between a third and 2/3 of their entire population. And that's physical, elimination of humans, not to mention destruction of villages, cultural heritage, and just sort of a general sort of erasure that occurs. Linguicide eventually also occurs. So it's a very difficult discussion to have about the Assyrians in the Middle East today. As I said, most now live in diaspora, the United States, Canada, Australia, throughout different countries in Europe, in particular Western Europe. And most places you go, you'll find an Assyrian diaspora. They're predominantly split within, they're sort of sectarianized, unfortunately, within 4 or 5 Christian sects. Most have some heritage or some connection historically to either the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Syrian Catholic Church, and the Syrian Orthodox Church. And there are groups of Assyrians who identify as, or Assyrian communities who identify as Assyrian, who are predominantly Muslim. So you have, they're small groups, but in Turkey, you have groups in the region of Diyarbakir who have sort of in many ways reasserted their Assyrian identity after years. Sort of follows the line with the sometimes termed crypto-Armenians. A similar situation happened in Turkey with Armenians who were lost their language and culture and names in a sense, and still retained some sense of historical Armenian roots. Something similar happened to the Assyrians. So you still have Assyrians that have been who are Muslim, who do not speak Assyrian, but have some sense of a cultural heritage that is connected to the historical Assyrian identity.
Well, I think what's really interesting just hearing what you've said now, but also in the past when we've talked, is the matter of identity as well. And I think you mentioned it just now a little bit in terms of certain groups being marginalized or kind of falling by the wayside, so to speak. And again, I'm very hyper aware that you know like light years more than I do about this topic, but I think with Assyrians making that comparison with certain things that come up in Anthrozoology quite a bit might be this, you know, sharing of the experiences and the history and the stories and what's happening in that community through kind of clumped together with perhaps, you know, Kurdish communities, for example, or something like that. Whereas with other species, that could happen as well quite a bit. I don't know if, without wanting to offend anyone by making that comparison, but I wonder if you observe anything like that in terms of identities kind of being clumped together or being swept under the rug along with others.
Sure. So I would say that, and this is not something, obviously, as you both know quite well, probably far better than I do, this is not something new. I mean, there's tons of literature that connects,
right.
There's a lot of literature, in particular, post-Holocaust literature that connects the treatment of, and written by both survivors of the Holocaust, but also Jewish academics, that connects the treatment of certain animal species with the ways in which humans were treated in particular places and times, and especially with the Holocaust. And of course, it offended a whole bunch of people. There were a lot of people who, within the large Jewish community, who were very offended by that comparison that was being made by other members or survivors of the Holocaust. That was deeply problematic. And I would say that's probably going to be the same thing as probably the more work that I do or the more work that you do on let's say this situation of the connection between Assyrians as marginalized and non-other, so let's say wolves as marginalized animals. And, you know, the more that these comparisons come out, folks will certainly feel offended by it, I think, in general, partly because of the way they look. I mean, humans look at animals, right, as non-human animal species, to say that they are automatically lesser. You know, don't treat me like them. I'm not an animal, right? That's generally the first response you're going to get.
I'm not a pig.
Exactly. Right. So I think that's one part of the response, is you're definitely going to get a little bit of pushback. And I expect that, and I don't think that's out of the realm of what we would consider as you know, appropriate. I may not agree with it, I may not like it, but I see that as absolutely something that will probably occur. I mean, I myself have been criticized for you know, within scholarly work or even within discussions with members of the community to say, you know, if you focus more on humans, you know, we're dying, sense of like, we're dying out. You know, there's plenty of people that can help animal communities. Who's helping Assyrians, right? So you also have that sense of it as well. And within, I guess I could say two things about this. Within the general sense of connections to species, and then sort of the ways in which some species sort of overwhelm, or the discussion about some species overwhelms the discussion about others. You know, during my work at Canisius, we saw this frequently, where we would talk about how most folks would look at large animal species, right? And so you tend to have people that will focus on humans, that will focus on, you know, defending or working on, let's say, preservation of elephants or rhinos or pandas, or, you know, these sort of large animal species, right? Because they're in your face, you see them, they're obvious. When you don't see them, it's also fairly obvious. And so they tend to get more of that media coverage, which then affects the way in which we view these things.
Right.
Whereas there are plenty of, to connect it to the way you were talking about the Assyrians being sort of subsumed within, right, subordinated within a larger discussion of marginalization. You know, some of the smaller species, I mean, actually physically smaller species will disappear. I mean, and I hate to put it in terms of actual size, but frequently you see that, right? Where because of the way in which the human eye, because we're so visually oriented, oh, I will attach to this, or I will attach to that species. Yes, elephants are large and deserve protection and preservation, but at the same time, we may miss something smaller that's within that. So cheetahs are smaller and cheetahs are disappearing, right? There's all sorts of issues with inbreeding, simply because or genetic diversification, or not enough genetic diversification because there's not many left. And they are sort of secondary, let's say, to elephants. But then you also have not just the physical shifting, but you have, and I don't know exactly how I would term this, other than to say that it's sort of a popular culture perception. So I always think of, again, if we're thinking of sort of large animals, and I think of Africa frequently just because it's something that people can sort of connect their minds to. People generally don't think about giraffes as in a precarious situation. And I don't know exactly why, although my assumption is that most of us grew up watching, seeing giraffes on like the Nature Channel or Animal Planet or something along those lines. And they're larger than life creatures, right? They have these tremendously long necks, and they're herbivores, and they sort of just walk around, mosey around. And we never really think of them as being, for whatever reason, it's always been portrayed to us as they've seemed to be okay, right? Whereas in sort of these other large species are disappearing for whatever reason. And the reality is that, giraffes are disappearing at a very frightening rate. I mean, they're threatened or endangered at this point, if I remember correctly. So, and yet they're in this situation where, at least for me, and I know for a lot of people and a lot of younger folks as well, they seem to just be subsumed under this larger discussion of, animals that are disappearing, right? That elephants will be more prominent, rhinos will be more prominent, things like that. There is one difference, and I would say the one difference between let's say the Assyrian situation and a situation like the rhinos, for instance, is that in the case of particular species that have very few in number, when you're getting down to handfuls or even single digits with some species, you would assume that in the case of the Assyrians, for instance, because you have a much smaller number than, let's say, Kurds in the region of the Middle East, right? As talking about two commonly marginalized groups. Sort of the opposite happens, where you have a very large, far larger number of Kurds that happen to have the focus of academic discourse or media, whereas in the case of in the Assyrians having a much smaller number and arguably being more having a greater existential threat against them, they're not focused on enough. And so that issue of identity being subsumed, and then they're sort of swept under the rug into the larger discussion about, let's say, marginalized peoples in the Middle East, and they'll be sort of connected to the Kurdish groups, or in the case of the Assyrians, which is vastly different than animals, they'll be sort of just lumped into a general Christians of the Middle East term. So there are some distinctions as well. And again, I don't, I wish I had all the answers for, I think it will take a little bit more research to sort of figure out, why this has been the case in these particular areas. I don't know, but I also wonder if there were 5 Assyrians left, if there was a very small number, would there then be a focus on them? If you could get down to a handful of people, sort of like a handful of rhinos, do people then focus on them more because there's so few of them, right? When you have a micro group, in a sense. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this, but recently a bunch of studies have come out of Wisconsin. Since they took away endangered species protections for gray wolves, Wisconsin has had all these hunts. And so huge, you guys have seen this, right? So many of the numbers of gray wolves have been decimated just in the past, 6 months to a year, I believe, in Wisconsin. And, there are a variety of reasons for that, obviously, but they were, they're sort of at the point of starting to do I shouldn't say quite well, they're doing better in a sense. And they weren't at that point of critical endangerment. And all of a sudden it was like, well, it's okay, because they're in that in between, well, if we have to eliminate a couple hundred of them because they're causing problems for the ranchers, then that's not such a big deal. And it's a really, it's a fascinating situation. You think, well, no, wait a minute. If you eliminate 300 or 400 wolves for whatever the argument is, you're actually causing more damage, and not to go into the whole trophic cascade issue, or, being one of these species that really truly affect the larger ecosystem.
Yeah.
Why is it that they have to get down to 3 or 4 members for us to actually think about them as mattering, or if there's several 100,000 of them, certainly they'll be on our minds, right? Because then ranchers, or at the very least ranchers, would remind us that there's something that we need to talk about.
This whole thing got inspired to have you come on, in part with conversations around diasporas a little bit. And so we were talking about that during our last podcast after we had stopped recording. And I thought, oh, I know who I should ask to come on and talk about this.
Yeah, actually, it ties into what you were just saying, actually, with certain animals being in your face. And when they decline, when there's risk, we see that as a general population. Even if you're not really in the elephant world, you hear about elephants declining, or rhino especially. I mean, and when it's the last of a species. So I guess what I'm curious about is when you're talking about a less localized diaspora, a more global diaspora, could that be a major contributing factor to the lack of visibility?
So I have to ask you, Rebecca, when you say globalized species, are we talking like because they're in particular places like zoos, for instance?
I suppose. I think I was more focusing on humans with that question, actually.
Oh, interesting.
So that's, the zoos is an interesting connection. So, I mean, for me, I grew up in a diaspora that's quite localized. There's a lot of Ecuadorian people that move to a particular part of Ontario, and I grew up immersed in that. But I know that there are other diasporas where there aren't really big clumps like that. It's more spread out. And I mean, in a digital age, people are more able to find each other across those big geographical gaps. But I guess what I'm saying is when we have a small population of a specific species that has a small local area, we see when they start to decline, but maybe when they're spread out, we're not as aware of those numbers. And what brought this up last time was we were talking with Shannon Riley about her work with the wild Mustangs in the US, and how they have their distinct ranges where they're kind of maintained. And because they're on those ranges, we're hyper aware of the numbers. But if they were actually spread out and wild, we may be less able to manage or even conceptualize the numbers that are left. So I was just wondering if that applies to humans as well, if maybe that dispersion is a factor in our perception of various cultures' diaspora.
Let me take one step back and sort of think of this sort of in a larger connective way. So if I think of the Assyrian diaspora, for instance, you have a worldwide diaspora. There are Assyrians pretty much everywhere. I mean, you could go anywhere and find an Assyrian family at this point. There are particular regions where the Assyrians live more so than in others, where you do absolutely get a little bit more of a focus on them, which makes perfect sense, right? If you have a larger community in Chicago, or in the Bay Area of California, or in San Diego, you're going to get a bit more media coverage because they're focused, right? They're locally focused, and it's not necessarily a super population, right? It's a large enough population. So if we're thinking about Illinois, we're thinking maybe, I don't know, 1 to 200,000. If we're talking about the Bay Area, we're talking about, I'm just guessing, maybe 75,000, something like that, 100,000. Again, Southern California, maybe something along those lines as well. And so you know, again, not a necessarily tremendously large community, but large enough that it's focused and it's localized, so people definitely understand a bit more about them. And so, of course, when you say, hey, I grew up in San Diego, and I knew there were Assyrians there. I had a friend who was an Assyrian at school or something like that. That's not uncommon, of course, because of the general idea of exposure. So there's definitely more of it. And of course, if something happens in the Assyrian community there, you're more apt to hear about it on local media. And there's a larger, just proportional chance that you're going to have an issue, whether it be positive or negative, just because you have simply more people. So I definitely agree. That's certainly the case with with particular communities. I mean, the hard part is, and that's now of course, that's talking in diaspora. So I'm talking of a vastly different ballgame than what you first brought up with like a home range. But that also brings in the discussion what's home and what's diaspora at some point, which is another very difficult discussion because, I don't know, once you've moved to a new area, do you automatically, is it now home? How long do you have to be in a particular place for it to become home? And you saying it's home is, again, one piece of the puzzle. Your acceptance within a larger group, whether it be human or non-human animal species, also is an issue, right? If you think about invasive species, we always talk about invasive species. Oh, there are all these invasive species. Well, if one of these species has been in the area for 300 years, are they still invasive?
Right.
Let's cull them. Oh, hold on a second. I mean, I'm all about, I do understand the native argument because, as an Assyrian and having very few Assyrians left in what we think of their ancestral homeland in northern Mesopotamia, yes, there's absolutely a piece of me that would say, no, Assyrians absolutely deserve not only a place to live in sort of peace and harmony in that cliche fashion, but they deserve it because I think everyone deserves it. And if that's what they see, if that's where their heart has always been connected to, because that's where they've come from with the Assyrians, I mean, it's 4,000 or 5,000 years at least, right? And there's an easy direct connection that you can make from all of the evidence that exists. So, that is certainly home, but I would be amiss to say that, or I would be amiss if I did not state that, outside of Boston is also home for me, right? I have a sense of home here that when I travel to the Middle East and do research, I don't necessarily feel that. Or I don't always feel that, I should say. It depends where I go and what community I'm visiting and what's happening around me, how many people are there. Again, in the case of Assyrians, there is critical mass in particular areas in their traditional homeland. So let's say there were 30,000 people prior to the advent of ISIS in a city, or let's say a town, or a small city town called Karakosh or Baghdad in northern Iraq, in the Nineveh Plain region of that area. And most of them fled, or many of them fled, because of the advancing of the so-called Islamic State. And as they were moving in, the Assyrians were fleeing. And so there was definitely a focus, at some point there was definitely a focus on them there, because the idea was, hey, they'd been here for at least a few thousand years, right? If not longer. And so we definitely heard about it. But what's interesting too, in the case of the Assyrians, is with the human communities, there's the issue of the way in which they're identified, right? So we go back to the identity issue. And so for the Assyrians, they've been here for a few thousand years, connects them to their Christian identity, rather than to say they've been here for 3,000 years, which would connect them to a more than Christian identity, to, let's say, their language, this Assyrian Aramaic language that's been there for at least 3,000 to 3,500 years, or to their cultural heritage, their let's say tangible cultural heritage that's not just based on their Christian heritage, but based on their ancient Assyrian heritage, which goes back to pre-Christian times. Or intangible cultural heritage, which is their folklore and traditions and culture, which also can extend, to pre-Christian times. So, with the Assyrians, it's tough. But I will say in both cases, both with the cases of the Assyrians, but let's say marginalized groups in general, that whether they have a large diaspora or a small diaspora, in comparison, let's say, to their home territory, and I feel similarly with different animal species, or I suppose even plant species, if you think of it that way, regardless of how it occurs, what's really fascinating is that while they may all have some agency, at the end of the day, so much of our view, since we're talking about lenses, so much of the way in which we utilize or create a lens based on this is all based on, or most of it is based on external factors. So if we think about like anthropological ideas and think about the etic view versus the emic view, right? The emic view being the internal view, the etic view being that external view. Most of it is etic. I mean that's across the board for non-human animal species, right?
Right.
How do they act? What do they do? It's not like anyone's asking them, they're responding in English or in whatever language we're speaking, and we're getting it directly from, the horse's mouth, so to speak, right?
Right.
That's not happening. So it's almost always an interpretation, or it is always a human interpretation of what's happening. And in the Assyrian case, again, even the categories that are created for home and diaspora are always created, for the most part, by non-Assyrians. And so there's yet again another connection, because it's very infrequent that, not to say that the Assyrians don't have their own agency, but it's similar with animal species, but to say that the system, this works very well in the situation of the United States, today, that the system sort of has been created to not allow them to have a space, right? It's been created in a sense to have them as a piece of the system without having the power to influence the system.
I guess that wraps back quite well to what Rebecca and again earlier Shannon was mentioning about the Mustangs not having that space either, and sort of just being like, okay, you've been here since the Spaniards came, but we're gonna move you and you're gonna become less and less, and we're gonna keep you so that you're just in Idaho or in Montana or wherever else, Colorado. That sort of just in my mind kind of circled back quite nicely to that. I don't know if that.
Yeah, and I mean, think about the ways in which certain groups were even divided, let's say, during the colonial period in Africa, right? Arbitrarily, people came in from predominantly Western Europe and said, okay, we're going to divide this particular area with these different peoples and cultures living in it just along this. And sometimes it was completely arbitrary, right? It didn't even go along natural borders or boundaries.
Yeah.
Sometimes it didn't go along ethno-linguistic boundaries. I mean, it literally just went, we're going to draw a line, because many of these works were done, sort of ad hoc, sitting in a room somewhere in Europe saying, okay, here's the map. All right, we want this piece, right. You want that piece. We're going to take this, you're going to take that. And not without any sort of thought process of, well, how is it going to affect them? Which is really, I love this, because God, this connects very well to Tolkien as well, and thinking about Middle Earth, I think, and Patrick Curry's work. But the idea that how connected we are to this idea of home, but how connected life is to the land itself, right? To kind of go to the thinking of like Aldo Leopold and things like that, to think about the land itself as having, or as being, an entity, and those of us that interact with the land as being a piece of that ecosystem, that when you take one piece out, it throws everything in sort of a chaotic tornado, if you will, I guess. And so, I have to say, since Rebecca, you mentioned Ecuador, I am always so inspired by the fact that in particular places in Central and South America, but Ecuador, I know in particular, has actually done quite well, at least in the way in which they've sort of protected particular areas, and thereby protecting also particular groups, let's say, in a sense, through this sense of personhood, right? Like the idea of creating, giving a mountain, for instance, a sacred mountain, personhood, right? Or a river, personhood. And so there's sort of these, at the very least in the parlance, whether or not that's actually implemented, right? That's a problem. The implementation of people actually following that, that legal situation or the legal thing, the legal code, right? Is that sort of idea. But I always think to myself, at the very least, there's a discussion about, well, wait a minute, can we protect this area completely? And how do we do that? And then what does that mean for the communities that sort of live there? And actually, I was going to ask you, do you see any commonalities? Because I always think of it from a Middle Eastern perspective, but do you see any sort of commonalities with what you see in Ecuador and with sort of these protections of these areas as being sacred?
It's definitely an interesting topic. I feel like we could do a whole whole hour on just non-human personhood, especially when it comes to not animals, like when we're talking about natural
Mm.
fixtures and parts of the land. I do know there was a particularly big win for protecting an area that was then just taken illegally. So the execution isn't always perfect. And I think one of the things that really ties into what we were talking about earlier with it being externally decided by the system, a lot of the push to protect these areas actually comes from its tourist value. Ecuador relies very, very heavily on tourism.
Mm.
So when you think about these protections being put into place and these designated areas being kept pristine for the romanticization of tourists, we're again talking about an external influence having control of how the country manages its land, which is just another layer on top of the colonialism that took and managed the land from the people who were there. So I think while maybe offering personhood to a river or a mountain or a particular area of the rainforest is a model that other countries should be looking at following for protecting their land, it's important to see where the roots of that are coming from and also how poorly it can be maintained, if that makes sense. It's kind of a difficult thing because it gets exciting. It's like, look, they made a big step, and then
Mm.
the companies come in and still use the land, and
Economics.
it's
Yeah,
yeah, it's very much like don't
sure.
don't ask, just apologize later.
Yeah,
And
and optics is totally different than, I mean,
yeah,
people tend to forget that optic piece, right? So what you see as, for me, I can see it and it looks amazing from here. But as you said, if you spend time and you go and sit in
Mm.
Ecuador and you go walk that area and then you dig a little bit into, as you said, the past and the reasons behind it. When you said that, all I thought to myself was, I was interviewed about recently with Euro News. They asked me to talk about the Pope's visit to Iraq. And so talk about optics, whole situation with that as well. Look, Christians have all moved to the north of Iraq where everything is great. And they're even going to build a Catholic university in Erbil in the northern region, in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. And everything is great. And that the reason they go there is because everything's great. And Pope Francis even said, you have created a safe haven for Christians. And so, yeah, to an extent, that is true. There is some truth to that, right? But it's nuanced, exactly as you're saying. And the problem is that at the same time that that's happening, there is a whole effort to disassociate anything individually Assyrian about the region, right? So it's fine, you can function as a Christian in Kurdistan, but if you assert your indigenous Assyrian heritage, then all of a sudden it becomes a problem, right? So, and you say, wait, what about the lands that are being taken away from the Assyrians? What about the issues of in the education system, for instance, there are these Assyrian schools, and people will say, well, the language is being taught. Isn't that wonderful? Look what the Kurdistan regional government has done. This is a step in the right direction. Yes, there is a piece of that, and yet, those books are literally translated from Kurdish into Assyrian, and the historical books, for instance, glorify particular people that massacred Assyrians, for instance. So they may have been heroes within the sort of the burgeoning Kurdish nationalist movement, but to the Assyrians, actually, they function as reminders of destruction or elimination, right? I mean, if Bedr Khan Beg is listed in a book as a hero, for the Assyrians, 1843 in the Haikari Mountains was not a very pleasant time, and 10,000 people either being killed or taken captive by this person, Bedr Khan Beg, who was the emir of the Botan, who, there are statues to him. There are There's a sense of greatness about him. And then if you're a young Assyrian and you're reading it and you're learning it, it sounds wonderful that you're learning all this in your own language. But what are you learning? I mean, you're learning basically that this piece of history, essentially you're creating a layer of history that changes your perception about what happened to, let's say, your culture, your people, right? It vastly it sort of distances you from that. So yeah, no, I fully understand that. And the whole idea that, things are great and everybody's sitting and working together, and the Pope met with the Ayatollah, with the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, and it was all it was wonderful. But, again, optics is one thing. To say everything is fine now when there are historical injustices that have not been addressed, where there are people literally who cannot have a piece. I mean, in the Nala Valley in northern Iraq, land is just being taken. It's being settled by non-Assyrians. It's being squatted on, and the Assyrians are just being sort of pushed off. And they're not winning these battles in court. They're not, because at the end of the day, there is sort of nationalism involved and ideology. There's economics involved, right? There's all these things, right? Hey, farmer X needs that land, so let's get rid of you. And you happen to be an Assyrian, so it's kind of I don't want to use this from an anthrozoological perspective, but in a sort of traditional parlance, that's two birds with one stone sense, right? We can eliminate two of them and not worry about it. So I agree 100%. I mean, the issue of optics, do what I do what I say, not what I do. It's a real issue, right? That as you said, the execution of these particular issues, saying it is one thing, doing it and protecting it is a vastly different situation.
Yeah, I think that's still, I just keep coming back to the Mustang thing, but I think that's such a strong romanticization of, oh, look at the wonderful Mustang and the symbol of American freedom and strength and endurance and all this kind of stuff, where at the same time they're being rounded up and slaughtered constantly. And it's just these two narratives. And I think it just wraps up what you were saying just now, but also this idea to kind of jump back to what we were talking about earlier of where is home. It's also quite interesting. Again, we've talked about invasive species before in inverted commas, and with Mustangs having been in the States, I don't want to say a number because I honestly don't remember how long they've been hanging out in the States, but that is their home. But they're still seen as these horses that are taking the land from cattle. And it's that interesting question where if you ask someone, a human in a diaspora, where is your home? You're always, I mean, at least for me especially, there's like 4 different places that I could call home, and I always wonder if you could ask a Mustang, and just to use that example once again, how it was just such an interesting thing because they're being moved around so much. They're coming from predominantly from Spain, all these different situations coming to one. And then to have the situation of them being rounded up and romanticized simultaneously seems, sorry, Rebecca, I saw you were going to say something, so I didn't want to.
Oh, it's okay. I think it ties back to the brief moment we had on zoos too. I mean, if you could ask an animal in the zoo, where's home? Are they going to say where home originally was? And then you look at the breeding programs and how animals are shipped around from facility to facility. Very recently, a report came out on the worst facilities, and our African lion safari in Ontario was the winner. And they have a tendency to, and you'd think like it sounds like a park. It sounds like the kind of space that would be a sanctuary. It is absolutely not. And a lot of the animals that are there are rented essentially to other facilities across North America for breeding purposes. So similarly, we're managing the population and we're managing their whole existence based on their value in perpetuating a species in captive environments, so distinct, so separate from what would be considered their ancestral home. And so it makes me wonder, like, I don't consider Mississauga, where my family is primarily located, to be home because I never actually lived in Mississauga. I just always lived like 20 to 40 minutes away from it. But that was where I could go to get the traditional foods. That's where my family was to visit. And so that's where I consider the diaspora to be largely that I grew up in. But I don't actually live there. So when asked what's home, I wouldn't say Ecuador because I haven't lived there. I wouldn't say Mississauga where my diaspora is located.
Mhm.
So it just makes me think like how we conceptualize that, and without all of the layers we have to process this, how would animals conceptualize it? Animals obviously including humans, but for this purpose, I mean non-human animals.
Um, Behind the apartment building where my in-laws at some point lived, there was a large field, and much of Mississauga was farmland at one point, and then it just became buildings, right?
Yeah.
Um, so there was this building project under Hazel McCallion. I don't even know if she's still there. I feel like she was there for maybe 100 years, running the town or running the city. And there was constant any place you found space you would build, right? Because this was sort of, in a sense, part of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, and you needed more housing because there's an influx of folks coming in from different areas. And I remember thinking, and it's a bittersweet moment to think about looking out back, and you'd see you could see them from the window, these rabbits bouncing around, or you'd go outside and you could sort of look out into the field and see animals sort of rustling in the leaves. And I remember my brother-in-law saying, a few years ago, those poor animals, where did they go? Because that was basically ripped down and a building was put up in its place. And so they were displaced. I mean, essentially they were like a human community being displaced. They were displaced. And they went someplace else. And then, what's interesting is when you don't have any place to go, and then a deer shows up in somebody's yard, right? And they say, oh, well, there's just too many deer, right? We need to cull the deer, for instance, or there's too many rabbits, we need to cull the rabbits, or whatever the issue is. Frequently you'll hear that. And then you think to yourself, but the reality is the reason there's not too many. It's just that you're seeing them in areas where they wouldn't have been before, like in your neighborhood. But part of that is because their home, their actual home, for whatever period of time that they lived in, is gone. And so they were actually physically displaced. So not only are you sort of a party to the displacement, whether because of economics, we're all sort of tied to that. But at the exact same time, when you get angry and say, oh, the deer are coming, we have this area where I live outside of Boston called the Blue Hills, and people are building houses closer and closer to the Blue Hills. And there's a constant argument where they've had a deer hunt for 4 years. There are those of us who've argued that the only reason that it seems like the deer population is high is because people are seeing them in their backyards, and they're eating my flowers, they're eating my this, they're eating my that. And there's all these complaints. And they're bringing in Lyme disease and stuff. And I won't even go into all the problems with Lyme disease and how that's far too simplistic and a discussion about Lyme disease, and the deer are bringing it in. Just as a little sort of aside, that you eliminate the deer and then they go on smaller species, which probably actually will end up in your house or in your backyard far more frequently than deer. But this idea of culling the deer because they're showing up in your backyard more frequently, and not recognizing the fact that you were a party to their displacement in the first place, that to me is part of the frustrating part. And in similar ways, it's sort of funny. This historically happened, connected to the Assyrians again, with the Assyrians, where a lot of Assyrians lived in the Haikari Mountains in southeast Turkey, and a lot of them came into what became the land of Iraq because they were displaced from the lands in southeast Turkey because they were basically being attacked. And so they fled and they tried to survive in different areas. And one of the arguments that's used by scholars, this is an amazing piece run by scholars, objective again, objective scholars, and by government officials, has been to say that the Assyrians are not native, or a lot of Assyrians are not native to the territory of Iraq. They actually came in later. But the reality is that, well, first of all, there were Assyrians in what is now the territory of Iraq. national borders don't really matter for a lot of people. I mean, just like for a lot of animals, these arbitrary borders that are thrown up don't really make sense. So that these borders are very artificial in that sense. But also, a lot of them came down because they were displaced by folks, both Eastern and Western. So for the Assyrians, whether they be Turks and Kurds in the region, but also because of the influence of the colonial period with the English, they were displaced. So then to complain that, well, I don't know why they're here in the first place, this is not where they belong, and then you sort of have to take a step back and say, actually, you're part of their displacement and dispossession. So to get angry at them and to say, well, they're the problem, and they frequently would call it this, the Assyrian problem. And what was the Assyrian problem was that we need to figure out a place to settle a group of these Assyrians who had come down from the Haikari Mountains. And the vocabulary that was used was always they were outsiders, they were alien, they were this, they were that, and all these other terms that were utilized. And it's the same stuff that's utilized when you talk about invasive species or particular animals that end up in areas where they're unwanted by humans, right? They are invading our spaces in a sense. And in almost every one of those realities, it's because of something we're doing, right? It's because of something someone else is doing. And it's the same with wolves. If wolves attack, think about the wolves attacking cattle, for instance, and people will say, well, they shouldn't have gone into cattle territory. Well, first of all, I mean, you're expecting a wolf to understand a human border of this is where they cannot cross, right? Okay, here's Yosemite, and if you cross this border, you could be shot. Again, not to mention that actually most of this happens on public lands where the ranchers are actually not supposed to have their cattle grazing. So that's actually illegal, and they get away with that all the time. But this idea of, if you do something outside of what we consider the place that's okay for you to do your stuff, or where it's okay for you to live, or where it's okay for you to call home, again, it's dictated by these external forces. And, they don't have, in most cases, marginalized communities, whether they be animal or human, have very little say in that. And I think it's because the system has been created so that they do not have that, because they don't function within this. And again, this greater political economic system, or socioeconomic political system that has particular things in mind, right? Like, I need to turn a profit, I need to do this, I need to do that. And these groups don't function. And yet, I should say, one caveat to all of that is, and yet, the only way to restore it and to keep things from falling out of balance again, let's say in particular with the wolves, or like in places like Yosemite, is to reintroduce those species that were there. So by the same token, very typically, there's an argument, or there's starting to be a little bit of an argument, and I've started to talk about this in some cases, to say that if the litmus test, right, to think about sort of Gandhi's ideas, like, the litmus test for any society, it's the treatment of their animals, or the treatment of, let's say, the most marginalized among them, if you want to think of it that way. So the litmus test for the functioning, let's say in the case of the Assyrians, of particular countries in the Middle East, or the way in which democracy in the Middle East is functioning, is it actually functioning? Then the litmus test should look at groups like indigenous groups like the Assyrians, who have been marginalized. And if it's not, you should be able to very quickly tell that it's not functioning because they are not included within the system. And by the same token, and this happens scientifically all the time, and we can see that in places like Yosemite or Yellowstone, where you remove a particular species and everything comes crumbling down. I think to me, it's so obvious. I just always wonder sometimes, doesn't anyone else see these connections?
Yeah.
And again, I also drink my coffee out of an Anchorman mug, so I don't know.
What is anything anymore?
I think in a lot of ways, those connections are seen. They're just intentionally ignored.
I agree. I agree, Rebecca.
One of the big movements happening in Canada is the reclamation and restoration of Indigenous rights. And a lot of what is said is rhetoric. A lot of it is like loud acknowledgement of the land we're on and recognition of what we've done and big apologies from our wonderful leader. And there's no real action. We still have reservations in Ontario, just 45 minutes out of a city, that don't have water, don't have fresh water. And that is absurd. And everyone knows it's absurd. Everyone can say it's absurd. It can be in the news, it can be stated by government officials. It's been years, nothing's being done because the system doesn't work if we give everything back. If we take care of the most marginalized, the system that we currently have doesn't work. Without going too deep into neoliberalism and the problems with productivity as a measure for human and non-human value,
Yeah.
it's not the system we're set up to function in. And I mean, that does mean it needs to come down. Again, not to get too anarchist about it, but it does need to be dismantled if we're going to take care of those most marginalized and most vulnerable groups. This isn't going to work. And I think that in a lot of ways, there's a parallel to be drawn there between marginalized humans and marginalized non-humans. But it's difficult because a lot of people want to focus on one issue. Whereas I think seeing the intersections here is extremely important, and everyone will get further ahead, everyone of any species, if we're willing to see those interactions.
I
And
love
it's
these all these conversations we always have. Anything with anthrozoological, because I guess we always say everything is anthrozoological once you get down to it. But I feel like every time we talk, we're like, tink, and we just touch this tiny spot, and there's all these cracks that come from it, and the conversation just spreads into all of these domains because it's just once you get started, there's nowhere to end. It just keeps going.
I wanted to thank you guys because I think that the discussion, I agree that animal studies in general, anthrozoology, is in many ways, it's sort of an all-encompassing field, right? It's or at least it should be. It should be sort of a field that allows a variety of different things to, or be sort of like a sub level, a framework for so many fields where it allows a lot of different discussions to happen. And it has that layer, and it also can sort of be sort of an invisible layer that reminds us that in most of our discussions, it's not simply about what matters to us, those folks in power, but rather there's a sort of a subtle overlay of all the other things that exist. And in fact, actually, when you look at it, it's far more vivid and colorful once you do. But we tend to forget it. It almost becomes invisible to us because we're so hyper focused on, X or Y or Z, if I'm going to speak Canadian here, and that idea. So I'm so glad that people are starting to, and I wanted to thank you guys, for the tremendous work that you're doing, creating these ideas or allowing for a space for them to be discussed. I think is extremely important.
Thank you so much, Sargon, for coming on. Rabba Basima.
And
and we'll see everyone else on the next episode. Thanks so much.